And welcome to Civil Discourse. I'm Jayme Marilyn.
And I'm Marilyn Brown.
And today we are discussing the role of anger in mindfulness practice. And I think where this came up for me was with the most recent mass shooting in Las Vegas. And I was just, in trying to reflect on it, I was having a hard time I guess just staying mindful about it because it feels like we've been here now over and over and over again and nothing there never seems to be any mindful conversation or action that comes as a result of these things. So it's hard for me to stay mindful about it because there's just every time it happens and there is no mindful discourse or mindful action as a result, I get more and more angry. And the more angry I am about the topic, the harder it is for me to then bring it into a mindful place. So I think that's an important thing because I think a lot of negative emotions or things we label as negative emotions actually help in mindfulness practice, but specifically anger and hate seem to be the two that stop mindfulness from happening.
Yeah, I think you're right. Those emotions tend to really get in the way of us being mindful. And just to let you know, and to let the listeners and viewers know, I'm having some kind of connection problem, so I'm missing little parts of what you're saying, but I think I'm able to kind of get the full story. So, but no, I do. I think that I've been feeling something very similar in this last week, and feeling much less mindful, and really struggling to have even just kind of mindful thoughts or conversations about any of this. And I think that it's hard because we have this idea that to be mindful, we have to feel peaceful. And anger is a very uncomfortable emotion. It's very action oriented. Anger wants us to do something, and so we get very frustrated, and there's kind of this churning, and it feels like nothing's happening. And I think the other thing that happens when we have these intense emotions that we don't know what to do with, and they feel very unproductive and very unmindful, is that we end up shutting it off completely. And
Mm-hmm.
so we get to this point where once we've gotten so angry about it and felt all of that and felt like it's not going anywhere, felt like no change is happening, we end up becoming numb to it, because I think that almost is protective in a way. We can't continue to like walk around and feel this intensity of this emotion, and that's not necessarily effective. But I think it's a result of that, of continually being bombarded with emotions where, again, there's no productive way to move through it. And so we're
Right.
just kind of cycling this same emotion, and it gets more and more difficult, and then at some point we tend to just start to shut it off. And that's a hard thing too. I mean, and so I think talking about mindfulness and anger is so important, because I think a lot of times we just don't even think anger and mindfulness are relate. Like, we don't think you can be angry. We don't think you can even have that emotion and be mindful.
Right. Yeah, and I think it's for me, it's often what's fueling the anger, I guess. Because if it's just passion or something, yeah, if it's almost like a positive, it sounds weird, but if it's almost like a positive emotion triggering that anger, it's much easier to be mindful. And I
Mm-hmm.
come back to like the hate. If it's hate is involved, then it's hard for me to be mindful, and that's really what with everything that's happening now is kind of where I'm swaying in between. Is it's there's this consistent anger, but sometimes the anger is directed at in a productive way, and sometimes my anger is really is to be frank, is really hate based, because it's just people are dying. They're dying regularly, and just there's no one's doing anything to try to fix the problem. We get stuck in these kind of rhetoric back and forth places that are a distraction and are purposely a distraction, and then it just becomes this back and forth while more and more people are suffering and dying. So on
Yeah.
this specific topic, it's hard in my own practice because I go back and forth between it being me wanting to be productive and have a passion for fixing the problem, and that
Hmm.
anger leads me to a mindful place, but then I'm also dealing with kind of a hateful element towards the the groups and the people who are trying to stop what I feel is any potential progress in fixing the problem.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think that's tough because as you were talking, as much as I think that I can see how that those emotions and that those feelings kind of directed towards the people who are stopping progress or change. I mean, I think when you think about that emotion, for me, the more you kept talking, I kept thinking, well, yeah, but that's still coming from love.
Right.
It feels very hateful, like thinking about it and kind of directing it and being angry and kind of the basis of the thoughts, I'm sure, are not, in a positive space. But I think that's coming from love for people and not wanting people to continue to be killed in this way. And so I think a lot of times, if we can kind of recognize like that it's not the directing the emotion, but it's
Mm-hmm.
actually coming from a place in you of love, then there may be a way to kind of find something more to do with that versus trying to do something with feeling like it's this hateful. I
Right.
don't know if that makes sense because it's just
Yeah.
just as you were talking about it, I kept thinking, well, yeah, but underneath that is love, you know.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
I think it's also how you use it, because uh, I think that the difference between using it in a mindful way and not is that leading with understanding. And I see myself specifically when dealing with this kind of going back and forth between seeking understanding to try to fix the problem and judging. So judging the groups that are trying to stop progress instead of trying to understand them so that we can have a meaningful conversation with people who are seeing things from their angle that want to have a mindful conversation as well, if that makes sense.
yeah, yeah, it does make sense. And so it's kind of going back to finding that way that common objective, that common something, and being able to listen to the other side. And we can't listen if we're in a space of hate and of anger and just really kind of um, absorbed with those emotions. It's very, very difficult to be able to listen. But I think the
Mm-hmm.
important thing is that that emotion is relevant. That anger, like a lot of times we want to go directly from anger to mindful action, and we really have to like give the anger space and do it in a mindful way. I think that's the difficulty, is a lot of times we do it in ways that are not effective. A lot of times, we vent, and venting, if it's not done in a way that's mindful, where you're, I don't know, I don't think mindful and venting really kind of go together, because I think if you're being
Mm-hmm.
mindful, then it's less venting, but just that kind of where we just talk about how angry we are over and over again, and kind of we have the same conversations with people who feel the same way we do, and it can feel really good to do that, in the short term. It can feel like that's an effective way to manage the emotion, is to talk about it. But I think a lot of times what we end up doing is just recycling that emotion and not actually moving through it. And so it's still there, and we haven't really found anything to do with it. And so it can be really hard to be mindful when we're carrying that around. And so I think finding some way, whether it's, journaling about it, or doing some sort of creative writing about something where you're able to kind of move that emotion through you, or just sitting with it. Just, sometimes in meditation, what comes up for me is really, really intense anger. And that's an emotion that's really hard for me to feel, and to just allow myself to feel, and to even feel like is valid and has space. I've always kind of thought, that was a bad emotion. And so I would try to push it away, and not have it real. And allowing myself to sit with that emotion. And um, it's I kind of recognize the more I practice it, the more I have the tools to use it, and it's much more effective being able to do that. And that's where I can get to that point of coming with something that's more action oriented, and that's more mindful. But I have to feel that emotion. And so I think we want to skip that, especially with anger, because I think we're afraid to let ourselves feel anger.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think too, a problem I see is a lot of. I think it's just natural when you were talking about venting, that we vent the surface level of the emotions over and over again, and a
Yep.
lot of times anger, hate, all these negative things that we call negative emotions are really just the surface emotion, and what's under it is fear. And specifically in I think a lot of the political topics we talk about, when we talk about the, I guess, I mean, both me and you both lead pretty progressive, but uh, yeah, I think when we talk about people who have different viewpoints as us, uh, I often see in a lot of the viewpoints that the bottom is the way why they feel the way they do is because of fear in some way. And if we're talking about gun violence in general, I see that a lot in the counter to gun control.
Yeah.
Is it seems like a lot of those points are based on a fear that I think it's based on a lot of different kinds of fear. But then the anger and all these other things that we see in the political discourse of it are emotions that are being caused by the fear.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think that's such an important point that you make, that beneath a lot of those very intense emotions we're having with anger, especially, and is fear. And that's that connection point. That's where both, or all sides, that's where there are no sides. That's where
Mm-hmm.
we can kind of have that common ground. These weapons to protect ourselves is how we stay safe. And for other
Right.
people, you've been taught that having them around is not safe, and it's not safe to have, these weapons around, and that they make us unsafe. And so recognizing that both of those are underneath that sphere, I think, is so important. And the difficulty is that when we when we see that connecting factor, it's a lot more work that has to be done for us individually, I think. Um, Afraid, and I'm afraid. And so how do we move forward? There's a lot more that ends up needing to happen,
Mm-hmm.
and need to do with how we're talking about it to people, how we're communicating. We have to do a lot more work when we're mindful. And so I think it's a lot harder to do that, and it can feel very overwhelming. And so a lot of times we kind of pull away from that piece, because I think when we see that common ground, then it's like, okay, well, it's not just you need to change, but I also need to find a way to change. And even if that's just changing in how I'm communicating and talking to you about it, that's still a change that can be challenging.
Right. Yeah, and I think too, with anger and fear and hate or any kind of negative emotion, the way we at least the way I classify, I guess the difference between positive and negative emotions are positive emotions are things that open you up to yourself and others, where negative emotions are things that close you down to yourself and others.
Mm-hmm.
And uh, it is a lot more challenging to be mindful because, specifically when you're dealing with people who are expressing or feeling fear, hate, anger, any of these negative emotions, they're closed down. So it takes a lot more work. You have to get past those emotions that they're feeling in order to open them up. And sometimes you can't open them up. And it's the same for yourself. If you're feeling a lot of fear or these negative anger, these negative emotions, it takes a lot more work to open yourself up in a mindful way, because the natural instinct is to close down and retreat.
Yeah, yeah. I think you're spot on with that, and I can really recognize that in myself, and I don't I think that I've made progress in that space of being able to open myself up when I am feeling a difficult emotion, when I'm feeling angry, but it's still I still will feel very shut down, but I'm at least able to put words to it and to like
Right.
identify that that's what's happening. And so it for me years of working on this has been just getting myself to the point where I'm able to say, I'm in a really shitty mood right now. I'm not feeling it right now. I'm very shut down. I am shut down right now. Actually being able to say that, and that's progress right now. That's a lot of work. And so it really, that is one of the most difficult things to do, I think, is to be open when we're in pain, when we're angry, when we're scared, because that is the most kind of vulnerable time to do it. Um, and so, yeah, I think that's important, and just an important thing to kind of recognize for anybody when we're having these conversations is being able to identify that in ourselves and recognize how hard it is to do that, and to be able to extend that empathy to the other person, even if we completely disagree with everything that they're saying and their views on everything. We can also recognize how difficult it is to be vulnerable in those situations.
Right. Yeah, and I think too. Hmm. I'm trying to formulate this thought. For for me, I think that I often, when I get lost in a negative emotion, is specifically when I'm interacting with someone, and if they're mindful, a lot of times in the moment I'm not capable of being mindful, but later on, once that emotion starts to subside, I'm able to actually process what they told me because they were being mindful, and it changes me later.
Yeah.
So I think there's yeah, it's exactly what you're saying. Everyone's at a different point in the journey, and yes, the goal, I guess, is to be as mindful as we can in as many moments as we can. But I think a big part of that is also not beating yourself up about it if you're in a situation where you're just not able, where you're at, to be mindful. And that's also not an excuse to not be mindful, but I think it's just an acknowledgement and a way to move on to the next moment. Because if someone
Yeah.
was being mindful and they said something and I was too angry and couldn't listen to it, if I stuck to that, I would never change. But even the ability for me to say, I'm going to move on from this and see what they said in a different way later and have it affect me in a more mindful way, that's a step forward in being able to then, in a situation where you're not being mindful, to be able to redirect that emotion quicker. And I like using that word. I use that word a lot in the redirect in my mindfulness practice, because I think a lot of people, you were talking about it earlier, about in the beginning people wanting to push things aside and not wanting to feel things or wanting to control it. And I think there's aspects of all of that really in mindfulness practice, but for me, the term redirect is how I've always thought of it, because
Yeah.
I'm not trying to necessarily run from any of the emotions or hide. I just allow myself to feel it, and then depending on what that emotion is in the moment, I try to learn how to redirect it to the next moment as
Yeah.
I'm moving. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I like that term redirect. And I think that's a much more loving and kind of compassionate way to even think about that process. So it's a more accepting way. It's not what you were saying about just that anger and being able to kind of um, you know do anything with that. I think that's really a challenge, and there's so much vulnerability that needs to happen when we are allowing ourselves to feel difficult emotions. And when you were saying that if there's somebody there that's mindful, that can that can give you an opportunity to manage the situation differently later, or process it differently later in a way that's going to
Mm-hmm.
actually be effective for you. And I really like that. And I think I've seen that happen in the moment as well. I've seen that happen when I really surround myself with people who I think are intentionally working to be mindful and able to have those moments where I can say, hold on, I wasn't very mindful right there, and actually be mindful in the moment and redirect it intentionally. And that's
Mm-hmm.
really such a gift when that happens, and when you're able to, like, in the moment, if there's somebody there that can have that accepting and yet mindful response to you, then it can really allow you to actually go that next step of saying, okay, I'm going to do this work of being vulnerable in the moment and saying, you know what, actually that was not, I was wrong, or I didn't mean to do that, or whatever the thing is, and to be able to move forward in that next mindful response. So I think that's so important, that if we have support around us that's mindful, it really can help us to manage those emotions in a way that's more effective, and helps us to, I think, move further along in that goal of catching ourselves more quickly, or not even catching, but just being able to kind of in the moment be mindful.
Yeah, I think to the other point, the other side of that is that mindfulness often leads people to be. Let me rephrase. If you're in a if you're in discourse with someone, and one person's being mindful and one person's being angry, and I think this goes both ways. You often can fuel the other one's emotions. So I often find that when I'm being mindful and trying to, I think it has to do with mindfulness from an outside perspective, often seeming like a calm state of being.
Yeah.
If I'm engaged with someone who's very angry, I often find that my mindfulness makes them more angry, and I see that in myself at times too, when I'm struggling to stay mindful and someone's being much more mindful than me. The fact that I'm not being mindful, and can't seem to get there in this moment,
Mhm.
often fuels a level of anger. And I'm not sure if people who don't practice or don't have the the conscious awareness of mindfulness practice, if that's how they're feeling subconsciously, that they kind of yearn for that calmness subconsciously, and that's what's fueling it. But I
Mhm.
think it's also important for myself to remember that that is often going to be the case when dealing with people. That just because I'm mindful doesn't mean that I'm going to be able to subdue someone else's anger, and that it's very likely that it could make it worse. So I think
Right.
just that, and I don't know why, what, I don't know what to say about that beyond I think it's an important thing to be aware of.
Yeah, and I think it's important to be aware of the other side, that me being mindful doesn't mean that their anger won't influence me, that I won't get influenced by this interaction. I think that a lot of times, when we're trying to be mindful, there's kind of this idea that it's like this feeling that it's like impenetrable, and we can really be influenced and maybe leave an interaction and not even realize it until after the fact that we were actually pushed into an emotion that didn't feel comfortable and was more angry, more unproductive, less mindful. So yeah, I think that's a really important thing to be aware of for sure.
And I think, I mean, every situation is different, but I think because negative emotions are, um, I don't want to say, it's what we were talking about before, because staying mindful is a harder practice. It's much more natural for humans to kind of slip into an emotional place as opposed to a mindful place that in a lot in a lot of interactions it's easier for you to slip into the angry place when you're dealing with someone of anger than it is for them to slip into a mindful place to where you're at. So I think that's, and I mean there's situations that I think are exceptions to that, but I think in general that's been my experience with
Yeah,
mindfulness.
yeah, I totally agree. I think you're right. So I have a question because I kind of want to shift gears and still talk about mindfulness, but thinking about anger and just what do you think? Do you feel like there's a purpose for anger?
Um,
Or what do you
I
think
mean,
is
I
the purpose?
yeah, I mean, I clearly think there is a purpose because if there wasn't, I don't think we would feel that emotion. Um, yeah, and I think anger tends to be um, a heightened emotion in comparison to a lot of other emotions. So
Mhm.
I think it is a very effective way of releasing a lot of emotional energy, a lot of built up e- emotional energy. So I
Mhm.
think in that it's often productive. I think where the struggle is it's like anything else, it's a tool, and I think it's often used um, more often than not uh, to to negatively affect others and ourselves.
Mhm.
And I'm not really sure. Yeah, I don't really know how I use that emotion as a tool for
Mhm.
positive change because at least in my own being in my own practice, uh, when I feel that emotion, I tend to redirect it to something that I personally feel is a more productive emotion. Um,
Right.
which then I become biased because I have that capability for the most part, and a lot of people don't, and that's not even really a testament to my mindfulness practice because I've always kind of naturally been a person who can do that.
Yep.
So I don't really have a reference for before and after, if
Yeah.
that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I that makes a lot of sense and I can definitely relate. I think that for me anger and changing that into something that feels less heightened. I like the way you described it as a heightened emotion. I think it's definitely a heightened emotion, similar to fear, right? Fear is a heightened emotion. And so I think for me, it's never really been challenging. I think that's kind of a just temperament. Some of
Mm-hmm.
us are just pretty calm, just different energy, and I think that's just something that really has not been a challenge for me. But I do think that anger in and of itself, I think that there is a pretty important purpose for that emotion, and I think that a lot of times because it's such a heightened emotion, we want to find a way to kind of diminish the intensity of it. But I think that, in certain circumstances, it's really important, similar to the way fear is. And I think in
Hmm.
our culture, the way we've been conditioned, we overuse it. We over identify with it, and we overuse it, similar to fear. But I do think that it's one of those kind of primal emotions that's built in to let us know if boundaries are being violated, if
Right.
something wrong is happening. If we don't feel that anger, if we don't feel that, then a lot of times we may not really know. And anger, that heightened emotion, that heightened intensity of it, I think it's trying to get us to do something. And so it is a very action oriented emotion. And I think because we, have over connected to it, overused it for so long, it a lot of things that we don't realize that it's kind of trying to push us into some sort of action, and into to doing something about it. And so for me, I realize when there's something that continually comes up that I feel a very intense and kind of deep anger, frustration with. Now I've kind of trained myself to kind of look deeper and try to figure out, is there something that I want to do with that? Is there some sort of conversation I want to have? Is there some sort of action that I want to take? And I think that, again, that's the hard thing, is that sometimes it means that I have to do things that make me uncomfortable, like have conversations about difficult topics with people that I don't want to have, and things like that. But at the same time, I feel much more effective in utilizing that emotion, rather than just kind of trying to minimize it to something that feels more palatable and then moving on. It's like, okay, well, if something is really, really making me angry and I'm not able to kind of let that go, and every time I go back to it, it's like that, I really feel it. It's like, there's probably a reason for this. And I may have some space of doing something about it that I just haven't really recognized and haven't become aware of yet.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting because I'm thinking about my acting technique and just acting in general.
Mm-hmm.
And as an actor, I mean, you can't really play anger. Um, it just, and I mean, I'm sure people can debate me on this, but in my experience, I can kind of always tell when an actor is trying to play angry, because it doesn't read as authentic. And I think part of that, and I can't play angry. It always feels kind of empty as an emotional state, because I think anger is one of those umbrella emotions that something is always underneath.
Yeah.
So I to be able to play that as an actor, I have to find out what's causing the anger, where
Mm-hmm.
the fear that's behind it, or what it is, the hate or whatever, and then that can ground me in being able to go to a place that is seen as angry, but it's
Yes.
never really about the anger. It's
Right.
about those things that are underneath. And I think that, I mean, as an actor, you're diving into a character on a much deeper psychological level than I think most people dive in to themselves. And I mean, that's true for me. I've psychoanalyzed characters much more than I've ever tried to psychoanalyze myself. And I think a part of that is the distance from it. It's just easier to see it. But I think it's interesting in talking about like the purpose of anger, and just in my own, I guess, artistic profession. Uh, I don't like, I can't. It's not a thing that works in my analysis as a way to feel and express emotions. It's never really
Mm-hmm.
the anger. So I'm now guessing if uh, I'm I'm wondering if anger is actually never the emotion. It's just how people perceive the emotion.
Mm-hmm.
And because of that,
Right.
we've started labeling things because we can try to perceive, oh, I acted this way, and that's what it's going to seem from the outside, so I was feeling angry. But is anger ever really the the root emotion being felt, or is
Right,
it
right.
always the bigger fear, hate, something?
Fear.
And I even with hate, I think
Hey, I was gonna
hate
say
is
that.
very much fear. I think it's just like fear and love are the two you feel, and then there's all these different kind of shooting off points with how you express those two emotions. But I
Yes.
mean, is there really another emotion in the category of fear and love? And I mean, sure, there's gray areas and places
Hmm.
where it kind of meshes a little bit, but I
Hmm.
mean, those seem to be the two parallels underneath everything else we feel.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. And just thinking about, I was trying to think of like any instance where there's something other than fear underneath anger. But I really I can't think of anything. And so I think like even just asking, I'm thinking now when I feel anger about something, when I identify this feeling, and it's a very, again, it's a very like heightened emotion. It's very physical for me. I start to feel hot. Like there's a lot of things that let me know that I'm angry.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but really being able to ask myself in that moment, what am I afraid of?
Right.
You know, is like, whoa, like that's like mind blowing for me right now. Like I'm excited to like feel some anger so that I can like ask that question in the moment, because I think that's where we can start to get to like what to do with it, and how to actually manage it in a way that's really effective. Um,
Mm-hmm. And I think
yeah.
very much anger is very much a the reason I struggle with the idea that it could be mindful is that it's a very judgmental emotion.
Mm,
Um,
mm,
in that, and this goes back to a lot of what we were talking about with it being something that closes you down and stuff. But when you think about you're angry at something, you've made a judgment on something else, on yourself, um, and are reacting based on that judgment of what it is. And that judgment is, in my experience, very often not the reality. And I mean, to take it back to the the shooting or anything like that. Like if I'm feeling angry, it's because I'm thinking, oh, there are these terrible people who are trying to stop any kind of efforts to fix this problem, and they're terrible people and I'm angry at them. And that's kind of the, I mean, that's an oversimplification of it, but that's kind of where uh, I live, where as soon as
right.
a mindful perspective comes into it, it becomes less about judging them as bad people and trying to understand, well, what's the fear that's causing them to try to stop these measures or try to stop anything from productive from happening, and
Mm,
how do we fix that? And I mean, there's different, that's not, I'm not saying also that that's what everyone is experiencing who's trying to stop it, because there's clearly other motives that go into it, whether it be financial or political or whatever it is. But even I think those at the root are still fear of losing power or not having influence or whatever that fear is. And
okay.
in the, it's interesting because in the acting technique I use, what you look for in each character is a base human emotion, and that is either something they fear that has shaped their worldview or something they need that has shaped their worldview. So it's I because I analyze my characters in that way, I often analyze people I'm interacting with in that way. When I'm trying to be mindful, I try to look for what is that fear or what is the need underneath what they're saying and what they're feeling.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, I think that that's a lot of what I do as a therapist, is kind of initially connecting to that. What is this person's, innate desire? What is their fear? Where's that kind of connecting emotion, regardless of their behaviors, right? And I think
Mm-hmm.
you're right that anger is driven by judgment. It's our judgment that something is wrong or something is being violated. And so when we decide that, then we're already kind of not being mindful. Once we've decided from our own perspective something is wrong or is a violent, then we're out of that mindful space. And I think
Mm-hmm.
that, not saying that there's not things where that isn't appropriate. Do you know what I mean? Like,
Right.
I'm not saying that there's never a space to not be mindful and to just be recognize this is wrong and I'm not okay with that, right? But just recognizing that when we are trying to be in a mindful place and have a conversation about something and connect, that we have to find a way to let go of those judgments in order to have any kind of movement and make any kind of progress.
Right. Yeah, and I think we've made this clarification before, but I think it's always important to make, is that there is a big difference between being mindful and leading with understanding, and um, condoning and accepting behavior that causes suffering. Uh, and I think that's a important distinction to make.
Yeah, yeah. And I actually think what I've seen in my own life and in the lives of other people that I've worked with, that actually being mindful and working on being aware, we tend to be less accepting of things that are violations of boundaries, because that awareness, a lot of times when we're not aware, we don't even realize what's
Right.
happening. We don't even realize how things are affecting us. And so when we become mindful, a lot of times you get much more careful with your boundaries and much more protective of that because of that awareness.
Yeah, and I think too we haven't talked about mindful activism in a while, but for
Hmm.
me, mindful activism is using mindfulness to find the most productive and useful solutions. And I mean, bringing it back to the gun violence debate, I mean, clearly I support gun control measures, and I mean, in an ideal world, I would love to see no guns in our country. Period. And I mean, that's a completely different debate. I'm not saying that the government should go do that right now. That's my personal what I would love to see happen. But I think when engaging with people who are very pro gun, what I try to look for is, yeah, that fear. And I think a lot of it comes from the same fears that I feel about there being guns, is that
Hmm.
they feel that without these guns, they're vulnerable, and that um, there's this mentality of like the good guys need guns to protect themselves from the bad guys, and there's a lot of mistrust of the government, and well, if they restrict our guns, that means that they have more control over us, and where's the next steps to it. And really, that's all fear, and it's really the same fear I'm feeling on the opposite side of the gun violence that is happening. So it's just what's, I think, how we express that fear and our worldview on that fear that is different. But because I'm able to acknowledge that people who think differently on this topic are coming from a genuine place a lot of times. Sometimes they're not. There's people on all sides that don't come from a genuine place. But right now, I'm just talking about people who are.
Right.
I am often able to have more mindful conversations with people, and yeah, I'm not going to change their whole worldview, but there are little compromises in the conversations that happen over time, because not because I've said, "Oh, you fear too, so your position's acceptable." It's because I say, "I understand where you're coming from. Let's talk about this and try to see what happens so we can come up with the most productive ideas." And I think in that is where the most productivity comes from, because of course, I mean, we've seen it through history. Being angry and violent in these things can create change, but is it the most positive change? And what are the negative consequences of change that's created that way? I think that's the conversations
Right.
that
Well,
the deeper conversations to be had around the topic.
right. Right. And I think is it actually creating real change, or is it creating an illusion of change?
Right.
Which I think is important to kind of look at when it happens in this way. Is it really real change that's happening? Yeah.
Yeah. And I think the other, I mean, now we're kind of going off topic, but I think it's the, I mean, it goes back to the presidential election between, I think, the primary with Bernie and Hillary, and kind of these two ideologies of this incremental change from the top down versus Bernie, which was very much no, you have to change everything at the root, and then that fixes everything up. And I think those are kind of the two main. Now, I feel like I backed myself in a corner now because I don't want to say that one's mindful and one's not. But
Hmm.
in my opinion, normally going for the root has a stronger effect on change, but can take longer. So
Well,
it's, you know what I mean?
yeah, it can take longer, but I think it's also more uncomfortable usually. Like
Right.
if you're
Mm-hmm.
gonna dig in the roots, like getting a root canal versus like getting a filling, it's like if you're going after the root, like it probably will take longer. And it's also probably gonna be very, very difficult to go through, and a very kind of difficult process. And I think a lot of times for people, that's what pulls what creates that resistance to that kind of change, especially like in
Right.
government. I think that people can be on the same page of recognizing that change needs to happen and these things need to happen, and kind of have the same base interests and needs, but that recognition that like going about it and going after the root is going to be a lot more destabilizing, and be very uncomfortable for a lot of people. I think causes people to kind of pull back from
Yeah.
that for sure.
And I think that's the tie in the way humans process time. Because I think, and I don't know if this is ego or if it's just the way we, having short life cycles, how we process information. But I think, yeah, it's a lot more painful. But when you go for the root, you fix the problem, as opposed to the idea that we kind of band aid
Mhm.
everything, but nothing gets cured. Is, yeah, that might fix an issue in the present time, but it hasn't cured it. So then
Right.
you're always you're leaving yourself always vulnerable to that band-aid being ripped off and that wound becoming even worse. And I
Yeah.
think that's what we're seeing, I think, a lot now, with I mean, everything.
Everything.
Everything, yeah.
With everything. Yeah. Yeah, I think you're right. So we did go off a little bit, but I think it was still relevant, but I want to bring it back to emotions because I have a quote that I thought was relevant to our talk. So it says, so this is from Mark Nepo, and it's in the Book of Awakening, having the life you want by being present to the life you have. So he says, we waste so much energy trying to cover up who we are, when beneath every attitude is the want to be loved, and beneath every anger is a wound to be healed, and beneath every sadness is the fear that there will not be enough time.
I think that's a very good summation of everything we've talked
Totally.
about.
Yeah, totally. I mean, he hit on, love, fear, and that wound. And I think
Hmm.
that's the important thing too, that I think is that's the hard part for us to look at for ourselves, is like, how am I wounded by this? How am I like, how has what's my wound that needs to be healed?
Yeah, and I think too also the time pressure is very real and is an element that really makes it all much harder. Because there is this sense that there isn't enough time, or that it's not going to happen fast enough, and that's all things that stop the mindfulness process from happening, because we get concerned about that instead of actually taking the time that we need to really listen to ourselves and explore and understand. So I think, yeah, I think that's an important thing to bring up that we didn't really touch on yet.
For sure. Well, I feel like we're in a good spot to end there, and I think my question for homework for people is just that question that I have for myself, recognizing if you're feeling fear, if you identify that emotion in yourself, can you ask yourself at any point in this week, what am I afraid of? So
Yeah, I
that's
love
my,
that.
yeah. And I'm
That's great.
excited to do that. So now I'm just looking for something to like make me angry. I'll just go turn on the news and I'm sure I can find plenty. So
Right, yeah. Oh, awesome. And I think I'm going to actually well, I mean, I always participate, but in the homework, but I think I'm going to actually post about it this time too, because I think that's, uh, yeah, it's something I need to do as well.
yeah, awesome.
Okay. Well,
All
we will
right.
see everybody next week, and join us. The Facebook group is Mindfulness in Action Civil Discourse, and you can complete the homework assignment. Yay!
All right. We'll see you guys next week.
Have a good one.